don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Tim Minella, who is a senior Constitutionalism Fellow at the Goldwater Institute. The Goldwater Institute is, as you'll hear, a libertarian-oriented think tank, and they have been pursuing and active in the fight against DEI in higher education. So this conversation centered on that work, and we started our conversation talking about some recent legislation that they had something to do with passed here in Kentucky, which is, of course, our home base, and then it broadened out to a more national level. One of my main concerns about anti-DEI is authoritarian illiberalism, or efforts that are not aligned with what I would say are Enlightenment liberal principles or intellectual liberalism. In my opinion, those things are undergirding principles of our democracy, and any efforts that undermine those things I find to be anti-democracy. So I pressed him a little bit on some of the concerns that I have on anti-DEI measures being in conflict or in tension with Enlightenment liberal principles. I do think there are some DEI efforts that are in tension with that, but of course, if we're going to be principled, we want to make sure that we're insisting on the adherence to and following Enlightenment liberal principles. So that's where my advocacy goes. If you're a school leader and you're interested in this kind of thing or dealing with this at your school, we do have some workshops and professional learning that can help with that. You'll hear me talk about it as objective pluralism, and admittedly, it's a really difficult thing to nail down in terms of what you would call it. We've recently renamed our objective pluralism workshop to what we're calling Restoring Enlightenment Intellectual Tradition. And in those workshops, we help teachers and schools understand the dynamics of authoritarian liberalism on the left and the right, and then think about how we need to go about teaching in ways that uphold that Enlightenment intellectual tradition. You can find that and all of our professional development at wegrowteachers.com. And I'd also like to mention that our PBL Grow 25 Summer Conference, which will be June 23rd through 25th in our home base of Louisville, Kentucky, is open for registration. If you go to wegrowteachers.com, you'll see along the top a link to learn more and register for that. And of course, if you have any questions about our professional development and learning, or concerns and questions, or anything else, please feel free to reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here's my conversation with Tim Minella. I am here with Tim Minella, Timothy formerly, but we're going to go with Tim for this conversation. He is a senior constitutional fellow at the Goldwater Institute, and hopefully I got that right. But I want to give you an opportunity to say hello, introduce yourself, and give a little background on yourself. And as I was talking before we hit record, folks probably are not all that familiar with the Goldwater Institute before we get into the meat of our conversation.
Sure. Drew, thanks for having me on. So I'm with the Goldwater Institute. Previous to that, I was a faculty member at the Honors College of the University of Kentucky, where I taught history and a variety of other interdisciplinary subjects. And I moved to the Goldwater Institute because I felt that although I really did enjoy that work teaching undergraduates, I felt that there were certain aspects of the university, not just the University of Kentucky, but the entire higher education system in the United States, that really needed some reform. And I more and more came to the conclusion that it was going to take a push from the outside, not just a certain cohort of professors that recognize the need for reform from the inside, but they needed to be accompanied by a push from outside. And so that's why I joined the Goldwater Institute, is to promote policies that, in my mind, are going to lead to the renewal of American higher education. And in addition to that, the Goldwater Institute, which is a a think tank based in Arizona that promotes classical liberalism, free markets, etc. We also are doing what I think is very exciting work in training teachers on basic principles of American civics, the Constitution, and American history. And we're getting that going by, in many cases, offering teachers in K through 12 the opportunity to come listen to experts in the field of these subjects and get some really good discipline specific knowledge of these subjects so that they can then impart that to their students in a rigorous way. Those are the reasons why I'm excited to be with the Goldwater Institute and to speak with you today about the various policies and work that we're doing.
So the Goldwater Institute would be accurately described as a libertarian kind of, or at least libertarian-oriented think tank. In what ways would you say maybe is Goldwater different from, let's say, the Cato Institute or maybe AEI, those kinds of places?
Yeah, Goldwater comes out of Arizona specifically. And I think in contrast to those organizations you just mentioned, we are mostly focused on the policy side, on state policies. And we believe this is extremely important because most of the education policy in this country, despite the headlines that are obviously being made at the federal level these days, most of the policy is made at the state and local level. And so we have been very integral in getting universal school choice passed in Arizona, in promoting universal school choice everywhere, and also promoting our policies having to do with the reform of higher education at the state level. Because one thing I'd mention here is, when we look at diversity, equity, inclusion, and what the Trump administration is doing with that, the Trump administration has been clear that they are not getting into issues of curriculum at the state level, at public universities. And we believe that's entirely appropriate, because the proper place to do that is for the boards of public universities and state legislatures, who rightly have oversight over curriculum for public universities, certainly. And so that's why I think that's what makes us different from other think tanks that share many of our perspectives and our policies, is that we are very focused on the state level and doing what we can to renew higher education in the states.
Okay. Well, I think we want to start, or I'd like to start this conversation maybe focusing on a recent, legal win that Goldwater has at least something to do with in Kentucky here, and then broaden that out. And I think talking about DEI, more in general, and then some of the things that you've mentioned, sort of classic liberalism and things of which I'm certainly a big fan. Folks who listen to this podcast would certainly recognize some of those things. But let's talk about the start with conversation on the Kentucky Council on Post-Secondary Education, so CPE, otherwise known as. We've got I think some legislation that has been passed, basically. That was actually, I think, co-sponsored, co-written by the parent of one of my former students who I've had conversations with, and trying to sort of give some guidance or some advice on that. But that was I think in the last legislative session. But kind of talk about what that legislation is aiming to do and why I guess it's so, Goldwater feels like it's so important in terms of getting it passed and dealing with the problems as you see it of DEI?
Yeah. So House Bill 4 was recently passed over the governor's veto in Kentucky. And it's a very important bill that that makes important reforms around diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and as you said, the Kentucky Council on Post-Secondary Education. So I'll talk about DEI in general first.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that diversity, equity, and inclusion has been packaged with feel-good buzzwords. Who could really object to the drive to make institutions more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive? When you drill down to what the actual agenda is, however, what we see is this all comes from out of this ideology that says that the American society is a rigged system in which the oppressors of various stripes subjugate the oppressed. And colorblind, neutral principles that say we should give everyone an equal chance, that we should have merit-based standards, we should have standards for character that transcend these identity categories. Though, according to DEI advocates, those are principles that are on their face neutral, but actually serve to promote and keep the oppressor group in power and on top of the social hierarchy. So at its core, DEI rejects the idea that we should not discriminate on the basis of race and other identity categories. And it argues that we should discriminate in the right way from their perspective in order to pursue so-called equity and to replace the American system with something more equitable in their minds. And so what I would argue is that this is a political agenda, very clearly, that should not be promoted or endorsed by any facet of state government or any facet of government, period, including public universities. And House Bill 4 in Kentucky is a very strong bill that very clearly and specifically prohibits various forms of DEI activities, including the establishment of DEI offices, the use of biased reporting systems, which allow students and faculty to report each other for basically any reason. If you're offended by a certain thing, even if it doesn't rise to the level of actual discrimination based on certain identity categories, and it prohibits the use of diversity statements, which I think is extremely important as a former faculty member. What we've seen across the country, not just in Kentucky, is that diversity statements which say, in order to apply for this job as a faculty member, we want you to discuss your commitment to DEI. What this does is it becomes very clearly an ideological litmus test. Endorse DEI or you're not advanced in your application. Endorse DEI and show your commitment to it, or we're not promoting you. We're not promoting you to the next rank, et cetera, et cetera. So the bill is very strong in prohibiting all of these specific DEI activities. And to finish out this point on the Kentucky Council on Post-Secondary Education, that's another extremely significant part of this bill, which Goldwater I would say was very integral in showing the problem with. The Kentucky Council on Post-Secondary Ed is an oversight board that sets policies, a number of policies for every public university in Kentucky. And one of the big problems we found was that they were using their mandate, the council's mandate, to ensure that institutions were pursuing equal opportunity. They were using that equal opportunity mandate to institute DEI policies that were in reality not promoting equal opportunity. They were promoting racial discrimination, and they were promoting DEI policies that are not really helping students, but instead are promoting this DEI ideology. So to give you a few examples, CPE was demonstrably requiring institutions, each college or university in Kentucky, public college or university, to set targets for the racial makeup of students, faculty, and staff. They were also highly encouraging institutions to use various DEI practices, including diversity statements, including academic courses that indoctrinate in DEI concepts. And if each institution was graded each year, each institution was audited each year by CPE, by the council, on their commitment to DEI. If they did not pass this audit, CPE could step in and say, you are on probation. You do not get to establish new academic programs until we see that you've either committed to making these changes or we're satisfied that you've actually met these targets. And so that was a way in which DEI was promoted, not just from the institutional level, but in a top-down manner from the council to every institution in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. So a very important part of the bill that was just passed is that it gets rid of this power from the Council on Post-Secondary Education. No longer can they conduct these diversity audits to basically threaten institutions with sanctions if they don't practice DEI to the council's satisfaction.
So this is the bill, if I'm correct, that was at least co-sponsored by Jennifer Decker. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So as I mentioned, Jennifer, her son was a student of mine when I was a social studies teacher and still in the classroom, and I've had lots of conversation back and forth with her. I certainly am sympathetic to lots of the things that you're mentioning. Like I do, and I've talked at length here and written about as well. What I think is a liberal authoritarianism coming from, you can say the left generally. It's a gross overgeneralization, but those DEI statements and the sort of mindset of DEI practitioners that might be rooted in something like critical race theory or critical theory, and I think of that as a sort of spectrum. I'm wondering, with this bill in particular, or other bills that you have seen and other legislation around the country, what would you say, and I don't know how, to the extent that Goldwater had any real influence on this bill or, again, other bills, what would you wish for that's not in this bill? Are there some things that, because, you don't have, I'm assuming, 100% control over the language of this bill. There's certainly some things I would suggest, and I'm happy to mention some of those, but what are some of the things that you maybe wish were a little bit different in this bill, or maybe some other bills around the country that you think are better in terms of the language and the goals and the outcomes?
So I would say Kentucky's bill does what it sets out to do very well, in that it addresses the bureaucracy that sprung up at each institution, and in Kentucky, this issue of the Council on Post-Secondary Ed that promotes DEI concepts. And it does a very good job at addressing that aspect. What Goldwater is advocating for across the country is for states, governing boards and legislatures to look at the graduation requirements at public institutions. And what we found is my colleague Matt Bainberg wrote a really important report on this, that there are one of our partner institutions called Speech First wrote a report recently that says that 2/3 of major universities in this country require DEI courses in order to graduate.
And this is post-secondary.
Yes. And this is general education requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just general education requirements. There's also a number of requirements at the program level. So your major requires certain things, including DEI courses. And my colleague Matt Bainberg took these findings and estimated basically how much is this costing. If you look at the overall cost of attendance, you look at the number of courses that are required for DEI, what's the cost here for across all institutions? And what he found was that at a minimum, we're talking about $1.8 billion over each 4-year period devoted, that is basically a subsidy for DEI courses, because we are mandating that students take these courses in order to graduate. I would say that this sort of requirement is particularly inappropriate for a public institution, because no other ideology receives this kind of favoritism in the curriculum. And it is completely inappropriate to have this sort of thing where we're saying this education, so-called, in DEI concepts is so important. It's more important than all of so many other significant things you could study on a college campus, that we're going to force each student who comes through our doors to take these kinds of courses. And no matter what your major is or what you want to study, we're going to force you into these courses. And so what we at Goldwater are advocating for is for state governments and the boards that oversee public institutions to step in and say, we need to reform these general ed requirements, these program requirements, these major requirements, so that DEI is no longer required. That we should not have a thumb on the scale here to push students into these courses if they do not believe they are valuable enough to their education. They would choose them of their own accord. And so that is a major thing that is something that I think would complete the reforms here that are necessary in terms of addressing DEI at the college and university level.
So you're saying that it's okay for universities to offer courses in this, as I tend to say, and again, we talk about objective pluralism and the importance of multiple perspectives, including those that might be, sort of in accordance with the sort of critical theorists and that kind of thing, that we want to make sure that everybody, within reasonable bounds, has a seat at the table, but no one group or one ideology or that kind of thing can say that we're the only seat at the table and that nobody else has any valid opinion or versions of that. And I do think that there are again some reasonable concerns in the sort of DEI space about that. And again, I've talked about that, I've written about that as well. Is there a danger, though, in sort of demonizing, quote unquote, DEI the way that it certainly has been, are there versions of DEI that actually are valuable and something that Goldwater would say we do want to make sure is present and maybe even advocating for?
Yeah. So we are very clear. We have a model policy on this. And what our model policy says is we want to define DEI very specifically. And what very clearly in our policy does not count as DEI, something that would still be available for schools to say, here's something that should be a graduation requirement, for instance, is discussion of historical instances of discrimination and hate and racial hatred, such as slavery, Japanese internment, the Holocaust, etc. And those sorts of courses or discussions that talk about the historical context and the instances of this and the importance of understanding this in an historical manner, those I think are very significant and important. Courses that would address and inform students about other cultures, to learn about, for instance, you could go anywhere with this, Japanese religion or something like that. That sort of thing in our mind is not DEI. What is DEI is this ideology that says contemporary American society is this rigged system that where the oppressors subjugate the oppressed, and that we need therefore this sort of grand overhaul of our entire society in order to make things right. And so that I would say that is often a straw man that is put up, that, well, you want to whitewash history. You don't want people to learn about things outside of the United States or things outside of the West. And I would say that's absolutely not the case. That a college education should broaden your horizons, should teach you about other cultures besides your own. The line for me is this sort of this sort of very ideological agenda that seeks to train students into a kind of cadre of activists to overturn an unjust system from the DEI perspective.
So one thing that I would imagine folks who are maybe a bit more sympathetic to the concepts of DEI might be banging their spoons on their high chair about now is that sort of pushback that we're seeing, and perhaps one might even say a weaponization of, talk about the whitewash kind of concept. When we work with schools on, we talk about creating reality-based communities and using objective pluralism and understanding the dangers of a liberal authoritarianism, the getting away from left versus right and being more concerned about authority versus liberty, John Stuart Mill kind of concepts. It is, we again have talked here, and I've talked before about the sort of authoritarian liberalism of much of that sort of DEI left. I sometimes I think it's a useful distinction. I wish folks would make this distinction more, or distinctions like it sort of, I didn't come up with this, but, sort of classic woke versus new woke. And the new woke version is what we're talking about here, right? It's this liberal authoritarianism sort of rooted in critical theory, that kind of thing. Whereas the classic woke is more in line with Martin Luther King Jr. civil rights kind of pluralistic kinds of things, classic liberalism. And so I think it would be helpful to make some of those distinctions about DEI instead of sort of a blanket, because I think DEI, there are great versions of it and important versions of it, and then some that we need to really wrestle with for some of these reasons. All that said, now we see, I'll engage in a bit of whataboutism, right? So Trump administration really going after DEI, folks being energized by it, maybe from, seeing things on Fox News or social media that are really activating and energizing them. And we see stories of Doge, removing Jackie Robinson's website, or, you can go down, I'm sure you've heard some of these examples as well, where it does feel something like whitewashing. I would say, and I do say, that there's this is a liberal authoritarianism from the right. So I'm curious how you and perhaps Goldwater think about those kinds of threats.
Yeah, well, my background is in American history, and I would say that any attempt to I don't know the particular decision making behind those examples, but I would say that I have no objection to educating students, educating the public about the history of racial discrimination and other forms of discrimination in our society. And I would say that Goldwater, like I said, is very supportive of getting back to teaching, for instance, American history and American civics. And that doesn't mean that you say everything was hunky-dory, everything was perfect in the past, everything about the Constitution was perfect and didn't require any changes, because obviously we've amended the Constitution 20 some times. And so that the agenda here is not to pretend that bad things never happened. What we're advocating for is kind of a full spectrum discussion of American history and American civics, and to have people really understand, for instance, the text here, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. So to give you just one example here, the University of Michigan the University of Michigan is perhaps the institution that implemented DEI most extensively of any university in the country. They have recently announced that they are reversing in a big way here. Mm-hmm. They have realized that whole pursuit was a failure. It according to their own surveys of students became less tolerant, less likely to interact with people who didn't share their race or their religion. Overall, a big failure. So they have rightly reversed those policies related to DEI. One of the deans, I believe it was, of one of their schools, I believe it was the School of Art and Design, released a tweet that he subsequently deleted. And remember, this is the dean of a major school at a major university. And this dean repeated the entirely false claim that the Constitution stated that Black people were 3/5 of a person. And this clearly refers to the Constitution's original setup that said that slaves, non-citizens who lived in certain states in the country, were counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of apportionment in the House of Representatives, to determine what your population was, how many representative you got, you counted slaves as 3/5 of a person. That does not mean that the Constitution saw Black people or slaves as 3/5 of a person. It means that if your state had slaves, those slaves should not count as full people for the purposes of determining what representation you get in Congress. The more, if we're going to play hypotheticals here, the more anti-slavery provision would have been that the that slaves were counted as zero. And honestly, and they should have been. They should have counted as zero for the purposes of apportionment. So would that have meant that the slaves, the Constitution contemplated slaves as 0/5 of a person? Clearly not. This is a very, very common trope that I think, and again, I need to emphasize this was put out by a highly educated person who was a dean of the university at the University of Michigan. This is the kind of thing that we need to remedy. This is the kind of ignorance that we need to remedy. And this starts, of course, mainly in K through 12, which is why Goldwater is working very hard to promote knowledge, basic knowledge of our institutions in this way. But I think that's where we really need to start. We need to start with some basic core knowledge of these things, and get that part right. And we can certainly then transition into bigger, thornier questions about the legacy of slavery, the problems of discrimination in the present, the causes of those things. But we need to get the basics right. And right now we're not even getting the basics right.
Well, it's funny you mentioned University of Michigan. One of the podcasts that I published or conversation that I had, I think it was maybe a month or two ago, prompted someone to reach out to me who had listened, who is a University of Michigan professor. And I had made a comment about, we were talking about the problems on the right in Trump and sort of, again, liberal authoritarianism in the podcast conversation, and I made sort of an offhand comment to say, there are also some real serious problems of liberal authoritarianism on the left, and just as a sort of mention, and that prompted the University of Michigan professor to reach out and was just sort of horrified or aghast that I would sort of equivocate those things or say that they're the same thing, which I certainly wasn't. My personal opinion is that the threat from the right and the sort of Trump and MAGA movement is more dangerous at this point because there's so much governmental power, which is, getting past the sort of DEI conversation that we're here for. But how do we move people, or how do we help people understand, I guess, moving past some of that sort of partisanship, that tribalism, that sort of gets that response, right? That gets like, well, what about that? Or if you're criticizing this side, that must mean you're totally sympathetic with the other side. You're an enemy, and that kind of thing. To me, that's orthogonal to, sort of Enlightenment liberal principles, which is pluralistic, which is curious and wanting to understand and be understood. And again, looking at authority versus liberty, not right versus left. So, some of the things you've mentioned here, education, certainly an area in which we work, is teaching the history of that and understanding the Constitution enough?
No, I don't think it's enough. And I think you raised a very good point. So one issue here, which is an issue that I certainly felt, even though I had great colleagues, I really enjoyed my time at the University of University of Kentucky, excuse me. I came to believe that my colleagues, which were mostly on the left, were in many cases very good teachers, took their jobs very seriously. But there was a structural problem. And the structural problem was the profession is just so far to one side of the spectrum that you don't get consideration of issues that someone from the opposite side of the spectrum would raise. And there are a few of us, right of center people in academia, but I've come to the understanding that there just isn't enough. There isn't enough to make a significant difference in shaping policy within the institution. And so one thing that I think is important, that is a long-term project that has no simple answers, no simple solutions, is we need some sort of way to promote internal productive dissent and productive disagreement within the institutions. And this, to your point on objective pluralism, on Enlightenment principles, I think sometimes this is overplayed, that people sometimes talk as if the entire university should be a debating society. Like we should, for every single thing we need representatives from different ideological sects, and college is about listening to the different takes on these things. So we need a Trumpist take, we need a Marxist take, we need a Lockean take, and that's all education is listening to these different takes on various things, as if the classroom is a giant Twitter thread of takes. And so I think that sort of thing is overdone in many ways. At the same time, when you see that speakers or invited guests who are raising issues and speaking from a perspective that is opposite to the prevailing faction on college campuses, and you see them continually, they are shouted down again and again, that people are canceled, that events are canceled not because of public safety. That's always a fig leaf. Because of ideological objection to what the person is saying. I think that shows the need for just more balance in these professions. Now, how do you do that? That's a whole nother podcast. That's a whole nother discussion. But I do think that there is something to what Madison talked about in the Federalist, that if a majority faction is allowed unfettered power, there is no opposition, that leads to illiberal outcomes. And I think we're quite clearly seeing that across higher ed.
Yeah, and I'm curious to what extent you and Goldwater might do in the K-12 space, and that's primarily where we work. Again, trying to help people, and it's a hard sell because most of the professional development work that K-12 wants to do is around pedagogy, things that will impact student learning and achievement and test scores and things like that. Understandably, there's a limited number of days and money for professional development. So, allocating it for something that gets at Enlightenment liberal principles can certainly be pushed to the back burner. So as we think about how do we help schools with that, and certainly thinking it's really important, it's almost like a mindset, right? Like we Enlightenment liberal principles. I don't remember. Maybe you do the sort of quote or the idea that these things are sort of unnatural, unintuitive, and they have to be taught regularly. And I think we have done a disservice over decades. This is my hypothesis, that we have gone to an accountability model that really disincentivizes the kind of teaching in K-12 that is more Socratic and allows for inquiry, and teachers who are good at that. It's harder to do that. Not that there aren't teachers doing that, and not that teaching hasn't improved, and there's some other important things. But to me, the K-12 space really needs to get really good inquiry teaching, and there's a lot of really bad inquiry teaching that can be done. I want to be clear about that. And a clear understanding of what we mean by illiberal and authoritarian, because when I work with folks, it becomes easily transparently clear to them of what those problems are on the far left and the far right. Give them examples, and they tend to want to go, oh, duh, well, we need to be something more in the middle, which is more pluralistic, that kind of thing. But the left has done a wonderful job, as you mentioned, sort of tricking, I guess, for lack of a better word, saying, well, I don't want to be racist, so I'll be anti-racist, or, something like that. Who wants to be against DEI? My opinion is that, sort of Trumpism, there's a version like you don't want to be anti-American, so we got to go along with these things. And people who I, in conversation with on problems of the right, they say, well, why are you so anti-American? And that's sort of the woke right there. It is, I think, really vital that we get K-12 teachers to understand those Enlightenment liberal principles and understand being able to identify what that looks like when illiberal authoritarianism shows up, and be able to help students understand that. One of the things that I talked with Jennifer Decker about in this Kentucky bill, and we had really great conversation that didn't go where I hoped it would go, is my concern about banning things, right? It's like we want to say you can't do this, you can't talk about this, you can't do these kinds of things, which to me, one, doesn't really solve the problem, because it'll probably go underground or be done in some way that isn't as easy to see. But my advocacy is that we should insist, instead of banning things, that we should insist on application of, again, Enlightenment liberal principles, classical liberalism, those kinds of things. Do you have any concern about that, or advocacy, that dichotomy?
Yeah. Right. So, I think you're raising some very difficult issues that, I don't know fully how to address them, but I think you're certainly correct that there is, if we believe in these Enlightenment principles of free inquiry and discussion, how do we model that, especially at the K through 12 level? Mm-hmm. How do we demonstrate, as you've said, what that looks like? And I think it's a tough ask. One thing I'm connecting it to in my mind is, I've heard you discuss in previous podcasts, the emphasis on getting teachers out of education schools and having sort of the education school being their primary training ground, and the lack of emphasis on subject matter fluency, so that the way you, I know there are exceptions to this, but the way you become a teacher is you go through an education school at a university, and then you get your teaching license and you go teach. Whereas, why not, say, go get your physics degree, go get your history degree, English degree, and go into teaching from there. So you have sort of subject matter expertise to a certain extent in those particular areas. And so I believe that is one thing that I would point to is I think we need to emphasize subject matter expertise or fluency more than pedagogical fluency, whatever that is. I don't think that this emphasis on pedagogical theory has really served to improve anything, especially in K through 12. And to me, I would think that the most important thing is that the teacher knows what they're talking about in whatever subject they are teaching. And so I think that emphasis on that mastery of the subject can go some way towards addressing the concerns you raise with modeling how inquiry works. So how much, and I apologize if I'm going on too long with this, right? But I'm recalling a previous podcast you had with a historian or a history teacher from Australia, mm-hmm. where the emphasis there was really, and I thought he articulated this very well, that you need to really scaffold these things in history or any other subject so that when you move into the inquiry part of history, for example, that the students have this scaffolding, they have this structure to rely on, and they're not just thrown into whatever the primary source is or the subject is. And I think that, in a way, is modeling the kind of open inquiry that we want students to do, right? That before you there's a certain aspect of what you're talking about there where you don't just like have takes on things. You don't just say the first thing that comes in your head. You take time to understand the ins and outs of the subject before coming to a conclusion, right? And that seems to me like sort of the classical liberal open-mindedness that we want to be modeling for our students. And just I don't want to avoid the point you made about sort of banning certain things, mm-hmm. Right here that you talked about. What I would say is certainly banning things. There are two things. One is that banning certain ideas from the classroom, etc., is a dicey proposition. How do you define it? The other is a practical matter of the courts in the United States. They have a jurisprudence where that can be struck down if it is not narrowly tailored, if it is not clearly defined. They can strike these laws down. So any sort of progress you might have think you'd make in getting rid of certain ideas that are perhaps not appropriate for the K through 12 level can be wiped away because you didn't take the time to narrowly tailor it, and a court throws it out because it's violating. They claim that it's violating the First Amendment. So that's the practical aspect of this. I would just say that I think in some cases it is appropriate to say that there are certain ideas in public school classrooms in particular that we don't want to be promoted. That we don't really, that, and these are things that I think almost everybody can agree on. Things like the idea that one race is inferior or superior to another race. That should never be raised. If you're going to raise it, you need to raise it as either this is an idea that is wrong, or this is a point of view that some people have, and by putting it alongside evidence, etc., we see that it's wrong, right? I don't want a situation where we leave it open to for the public school seeming even to endorse those sorts of ideas. So while I agree mostly with what you're saying about the dangers of prohibiting things, I think there are certain things that almost everyone could agree on that we don't need to be discussing in K through 12. College is a different story, but K through 12 specifically.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, I think, is developmental appropriateness. And, there's really no reason to be talking about critical race theory or application of critical race theory, in my opinion, in elementary and probably even in middle school. Certainly some courses where it might be a part of sociology or even history. But to your point, I think it is like, this is what some people think. I mean, I would, as a side note, say not only should we not teach people that one race is superior or inferior or anything like that, but the fact that race is actual truth is something that we should disabuse people of. It's not scientifically, it's not a thing. It's just an idea that we use. But putting that aside, maybe my last question, no promises, but I'm curious to the extent that you might have some thoughts or ideas. One of the things that I'm engaging in with an organization that perhaps folks will hear a little bit more about is some work on thinking about how we might, judge whether curriculum in K-12 schools, things that teachers are using as curriculum, are they aligned with and useful in terms of being, again, aligned with Enlightenment liberal principles. And so we're working on that process to think about how we might help schools and maybe boards and legislatures and things like that. Because as you probably well know, legislatures are not well known for their deep understanding of teaching and learning and education. They're busy doing other things. But I'm curious to the extent that you or Goldwater have thought about some of those curricular pieces, especially in terms of K-12. What might be some things that you would look for in curriculum that would be, again, aligned with sort of Enlightenment classical liberal principles? And I'm putting you on the spot, so
yeah. So I guess I'm not speaking entirely for Goldwater here, but I would return to the idea that and this is kind of sidestepping your question regarding Enlightenment liberal principles, but I would say that one of the purposes of schooling is to form citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things you need to do, in my opinion, to accomplish that is you need to give future citizens an education in their own country, and not to go too far with this, but like I don't believe that they should be taught to hate their own country. They should certainly be taught about its flaws, and they should be taught about the conflicts within their country's history. But I think it's very important that it is taught from a perspective that really gives them a solid grounding in. This is how I'm connecting it to Enlightenment principles, in for example, the Enlightenment principles that played a big part in the founding of this country itself.
Undergird our democracy.
Right. And of course you could also, you should teach the tensions within that, the conflicts within that, and conflicts over what that means exactly, and how we create policies that reflect that. And I think in terms of what Goldwater is doing, one of the texts that we use in our teacher trainings is called Land of Hope, and it's by an accomplished historian, Wilfred Maclay. And this is a this is a very detailed, challenging textbook that nonetheless has this, what I would say is a very good overall narrative that is an invitation to the great American story. And again, not to get rid of the warts, but not to focus exclusively on the warts in American history. And I think, and one of the reports we've released on this is to compare this text, Maclay's text, with something that is unfortunately still used, despite the many times people have debunked it and pointed out its massive shortcomings, which is Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, which again, the objection is not just to only focusing on the bad parts of American history, but I think a larger critique here is that Zinn relentlessly pursues this single-minded ideological perspective, where everything in American history is a fight between the so-called haves and the have-nots, and everything is seen through that particular prism. That, I think that when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're single-mindedly focused on promoting and using this one ideology, that leads to a lot of errors and omissions, and a lack of understanding. And I think that fits with what you're discussing about Enlightenment, liberalism, and open-mindedness. So I hope that answers some of your questions. But that's just a start, obviously.
Yeah, and I appreciate like I said, I put you on the spot there. It's like come up with the novel ideas on the spot here. Well, are there any things that you would add to, like I was thinking, what would be an ideal sort of outcome or educational landscape? What would that look like ideally for you in Goldwater in terms of sort of DEI kinds of principles? Certainly, I think this conversation have illuminated a lot of what you would say and what you would want. Are there any other pieces that you would add to that, or bow ties that you would want to put on that?
Yeah, I would just say that, and this is related to what I've been discussing with our teacher training efforts. What I think is what we've been discussing most of the time here is, especially when it comes to DEI legislation, is sort of we've had a lot of bad policies put forward, and we need to, and the DEI legislation tackles those policies, says you can't do those things that are a large net negative for educational institutions. But that obviously is not enough. What we also need to do is to give people really positive alternatives. And that is one of the things we're trying to do in this report that compares the Maclay text to the Zinn text, is to say, here's a positive alternative that you can use in your classroom that would give kids a better education than what the alternatives are. And so there's a number of other things I would get into, but I think this goes to the larger discussion surrounding school choice there is a I am the Goldwater and I and a lot of us on the right are 100% behind any effort to give people more choices when it comes to their child's education. But that's not enough either. We need to give parents good choices. We need to highlight the models that are working. There are lots of choices that parents could make in school choice programs that would be just as poor as the current options they have without school choice.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the work you're doing in terms of thinking about how you integrate inquiry into K through 12 classrooms, the work that other people are doing in the classical school movement, all of these are potential really good models that we need to highlight and we need to direct people towards and say you should consider this for your child for the following reasons, and have a really robust evidence base to do that with. So I think that is really the next step is quote unquote after DEI. What are the positive models that we can point towards to say, here's what is a better way in education in the future?
Yeah, well, I've certainly advocated for and am an advocate for school choice. I talked with, and I've, had multiple conversations. Maybe you've listened to the one with Neil McCluskey, who I'm sure you're familiar with at Cato. My biggest concern with school choice is that perhaps the quality of education is often left out of that conversation, that the idea that more choice necessitates better quality, I don't think is true. And I'm maybe, again, hopefully, probably last question. I agree with you that the federal level is not where those decisions should be made. Federalism, and we talk about states and local school boards making those kinds of choices, and that's where that should lie. And I think the Trump administration's got some real tensions and conflicts in how they're dealing with that. But I do wonder if there is not a role of the federal government in terms of whether it's Department of Education commissioner or whatever role that might be, to help states sort of create that understanding and sort of baseline. What are the common denominators of quality of education, and perhaps insistence on Enlightenment liberal, classical liberal principles that should be happening in all of our publicly funded schools, whether they're charters or whatever. And to me, that's one of the things where we've seen some real failings at the federal level, insofar as there's just not a clear and concise message and messaging and what it should look like. So I'm just curious, how you think about that kind of role of at the federal level.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Yeah, because I think the issue here is anytime you say the federal government should promulgate certain principles or certain policies regarding education, I think you instantly summon the specter of Common Core. You summon the specter of a national curriculum, which I think almost everyone, well, I shouldn't say that, almost everyone on the right would oppose a sort of national top-down curriculum of certain things. There are some on the right, I will say, that advocate things like requiring the the colleges and universities that accept federal funding to commit to certain, I think you would call them liberal principles, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like to prevent the disruption of classes or speeches through robust disciplinary policies for students who violate that, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, if there's a way to narrowly tailor that, I would not be outright opposed to that sort of thing. But I think you do get into a danger when you start to do that, because it quickly goes into, should the federal government have something to say about the curriculum, which I would oppose.
Right.
And that's why Goldwater is working at the state level to make these curricular reforms, because we don't want the feds instituting this for all 50 states. But yeah, so I think that is a discussion. That is certainly a tension among conservatives and people on the right and libertarians. We want to promote choice and kind of classical liberalism. What role does the federal government have in that? And I will say that the Trump administration has made it clear that their executive orders targeting DEI do not extend to the curriculum. They have said that in memos that they're not implementing any sort of guidance about the curriculum, which I think is appropriate. They are, of course, going after DEI in terms of the bureaucracies and the policies and the actionable discrimination in a legal sense. So yeah, it's a tension on the right here.
Yeah. Well, any advocacy for federal level leadership on my part, you obviously want to make sure that there's some sort of limiting principle. But again, that's a challenge. So Tim is a senior constitutional fellow at the Goldwater Institute. Any links and things you want folks to visit and see and go to?
We're at goldwaterinstitute.org. You can see our policy reports, our items explaining various DEI actions in terms of legislation, and also actions by state boards like that in North Carolina recently that eliminated DEI from program and general ed requirements. I'm on Twitter at Tim Minella. And I really appreciate you having me. Thank you very much, Drew.
Yeah, well, thanks for the conversation. I appreciate it as well.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.